All right, so I am going to talk from my work um, researching platform skills, or professional skills, and skills in other kinds of practice traditions, um, leveraging Gendlin's philosophy of the implicit. Just by way of context, my sort of research areas, my disciplinary roots are actually in philosophy and psychology, and I think of philosophy as really as my root discipline. But I've moved on from there to focus on practice traditions, and I've done a lot of work for many decades, actually, probably about well, 3.5, on environmental management practice. A lot of work in the area of reflective practice, particularly felt sense-centered work, and then crossings of the two, some of which I'll talk about today, and also in research practice, which is also in play here. Um, it, the wide thing to appreciate about that is that whereas in many research contexts, people who are researching practices look at the practices that are there, my orientation is much more around how can we do research and development within practice traditions to help them evolve. So I've been very committed to helping environmental management evolve, and also to helping various kinds of reflective practice evolve.
Greg, can I just, for the sake of the non-native speaking audience,
Yep.
could you just slow down a little bit?
Okay, thank you. And please feel free to remind me again.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll
I will
probably need
I will make a sign. Yeah. Yeah.
it. Yeah, okay. So, so the outline of this talk is I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by platform skills, and then I'm going to spend some time talking about felt sense-centered reflective practice experiments, which is a way of researching them. And then what I mean by modeling sensibilities will become clear when we get to it, but it's related to that. And then I want to talk about some ways to carry forward Gendlin's practice tradition, in which felt sensing is central, but there are opportunities to shift the kind of modes of experiencing which are fundamental in the focusing practice, amongst other things. And I'm going to conclude with some edges for research. I want to get across the importance, really, of committing time and energy to carrying forward practice traditions. It's a curious thing, which I'll touch on a bit more, how marginal that is in some of our disciplinary contexts. And I think it needs to be central in many more. And I want to talk about some of the breadth of the opportunities and talk specifically about how the philosophy of the implicit can help with that. So when I use the phrase platform skills, I'm talking about the way the word platform is used in information technology. So an operating system on a computer provides basic services like displays to the screen and writing to and from hard disks and so on. And those services then get used by many other specific practices. So the idea behind a platform skills research program is that it moves towards those basic skills upon which skillful practice depends. And, conversation, negotiation, reflective practice, creative thinking, they're all familiar skills. And then below that, you can look at levels like dropping into felt sensing or coming out to patterns. And in the research traditions, these skills are generally researched relatively independently. How they function in practice, though, is more like one whole crossed grounding for moving forward. And so if you take any one of them, you'll find that you can find the others within it. So, for example, creative thinking involves reflecting, noticing what ideas have come and how they sit. Reflecting involves thinking creatively, particularly when you're orienting towards an adaptation. Similarly, interest-based negotiation is often recommended in situations of conflict. But to differentiate your positions, what you want from your interests, involves sitting quietly, or can involve sitting quietly and dropping in to notice where in fact you're coming from. And that kind of interdependence is something that you'll find running through the practices that are underpinning our ordinary living, both in sort of familial and professional and other contexts. And that kind of complexity is pointed to explicitly by Gendlin with his term veving, of everything by everything in, so to speak. Pointing to very rich crossings. I'll give some more examples in a minute. And I just note that Gendlin's sensitivity to this cross nature of experiencing as some of its, as one of its important roots, Whitehead's contributions. So I think there's an opportunity to develop a new field of research here and possibly a new discipline. I think it could be a discipline analogous to materials science. Materials science sits drawing on physics and chemistry and doing technological explorations of materials to come up with new opportunities for chips and ceramics and so on. I think we can do the same kind of thing in the area of practice research, explore this kind of scope for crossing different kinds of practice in our disciplinary contexts. And Gendlin's name for the work that this sort of sits in is first-person science, and this is a kind of a classic description of that from a paper he wrote. And I'll read the second half of that. Within a process model, which is what he thinks is essential for dealing with these kinds of phenomena, there is no precision in terms of units, nor about the whole. The model is precise in another way. There are precise distinctions between different kinds of process, precise ways to identify whether a given kind of process is occurring or not, and precise conditions under which it can be brought about and its precise results are specified. So it's that precision and description of process is what he thinks is the heart of this work. And that very much is the inspiration for the work I'm talking about here. And his text, A Process Model, provides a set of basic concepts. I have to say I was very excited when I encountered it in the late 90s in a sort of pre-formal publication form, precisely because it did offer finely differentiated concepts for talking about his focusing practice. So in a process model, the definition he offers is of living as occurring into implying, carrying forward. And he makes a very deliberate decision there, as the quotation indicates, to start from occurring into implying as root terms. I'll go into a little more depth shortly about what that means in practice, but it's to note to begin with that a quite complicated schema describing fundamental differences in kinds of process emerges from that. So there's an initial description of tissue process, and then he characterizes behavior space, which is the kind of mode of living that is characteristic of animals and on his understanding. And then sort of a proto-language cultural space, a social cultural space, in which cultural patterns dominate, and then directly referencing felt experiencing and felt understanding, which is the space that focusing characterizes. So what does he mean by the implicit? It's the heart of it is a subtle shift in focus to what he calls implying, to explicating where people are coming from, what people imply, their sense of orientation, where they're headed. Now, where you're coming from is not something you can observe in a direct way looking at another person, but you certainly can feel it and experience it. Well, you can see traces observing, but it's not directly observable. Hunger is one of his paradigmatic examples. So hunger is the implying of eating, but eating in turn implies defecating, implies becoming hungry again and eating again. And so the word imply is pointing to that kind of open forward orientation that we find as a familiar thing, which is very much something we appreciate, and yet which is not much theorized, as he emphasizes. And to just point to the level of complexity involved in this, if you understand the terms occurring into, implying, carrying forward in a usual fashion, making our usual assumptions about time, then you'll say, oh, we have implying, and then we have occurring into the implying, and then we have carrying forward. And part of his point there is that in a certain sense, that way of thinking through the conventional model of time deforms how experiencing actually is. And so Jen asks us instead to, as he puts it at the bottom of this quote, let the relation between occurring and implying generate time, rather than saying that life processes go on in time. And if you make that Gestalt shift, you have a much more astute and revealing frame of reference for understanding experiential processes. To give a longer example, this is from a book chapter on kangaroo know-how, as it happens, but I picked this because it's a familiar example for many. So if you think about drafting or editing, when you feel when we have a sentence that needs to change, we imply a change. So the word implying there is pointing to that sense of, I'm reading my text, and as I'm reading my text, the text is occurring into me, and I am feeling the need to do more. So that's occurring into implying, happening as one movement. And as the process carries forward or moves forward, it may carry forward and a word comes that actually feels like it fits. So in that example, we've got the forward orienting. There's a great deal that's relevant crossing in the implying. So when I'm feeling for the words that might fit my audiences in mind, my topics in mind, my purposes are in mind, and many other considerations. So implying is a term in part that points to this complexity. The forward orienting openness is there. We don't imply concrete particular occurrences. There's a kind of openness which we're familiar with from first-person experience, but it's not so easy to grasp conceptually. And when something fits, we feel carried forward. So again, to point a bit more to the complexity of this, the process model, the whole text is building out a story about implying and occurring, and it's very extensive. But another couple of small windows into that complexity are Gendlin's terms of veving and inter-effecting. And veving speaks to the breadth of the crossing. So right now, as we're talking, you're taking in my words, I'm finding my words to speak. There's a crossing of that in the context of each of us having engagements in our lives which bring us here, working on this area of research, etc. And many other considerations are in play. And veving points to that, and inter-effecting points to the fact that whereas we might conventionally think of these as a set of separate considerations that interact in some fashion and in a way that takes time, the way when things come, when words come, what's going on is they're actually functioning together in the shaping in a way that is distinct from sequential things happening through time. So those are enough to point to the complexity. And in these terms, the focus of my research really is transforming implying. So finding new ways to orient, and that means something as simple as doing environmental management practice and seeing what's possible. It also means exploring focusing and mindfulness and other practices like that, and exploring at a more personal and more underlying level potentials. And the kind of work that this involves can be, as we'll see, at one and the same time, making a contribution to a kind of more explanatory science orientation towards these phenomena and carrying forward practice traditions. So I want to dip in now to felt sense-centered reflective practice experiments, which come from crossing Donald Schoen's work on reflective practice and Gendlin's work on focusing and felt sensing generally. as a prelude to that, my underlying methodological orientation, on the left there's a scaffold which comes from Crotty, which is very useful for disciplining us when we're explaining our assumptions. But my epistemological intuitions are pragmatist. I like James's phrase, agreeable leading. We go with what feels like it fits, if we put it Gendlinianly. And the theoretical orientation I come from particularly is a hermeneutic one with an emphasis on understanding. And those are both groundings that are very natural ones if you're coming from an appreciation that our felt understanding is the place from which our words come, and which they are responsive. They are responsible to, as it were. Words that fit have to be the ones that fit our felt understanding. And once you appreciate that, conceptual statements are ones that they have a kind of relativity to felt understanding, and so the conceptual statements can't be foundational in the way a correspondence theory of truth, for example, might ask of you. And then the methodology, I ask how-to questions with reflective practice experiments, and my core method, which I'll explain a little bit more now, is reflective practice experiments. And there are two fundamental elements to it, evident in the naming. The experimental practice approach comes from Schoen. He differentiates exploratory practice, which is practicing orienting from curiosity, from move testing, which is trying out moves that you think might be helpful, and from hypothesis testing, where you think, oh, I think if I do such and such, I think it will produce this result, and that'll be good. And that differentiation is a useful one for noticing the different kinds of things we do when we're exploring how to be effective, how to be skillful in our practice. Schoen points in a modest way towards how feeling what we're doing is very important for that. But of course, if you bring in Gendlin, as I do, and as I'm recommending that we do, we have a much more explicit and much more disciplined understanding of the felt ground playing into making choices as we practice. And it's that combination of that exploratory, experimental approach to trying things out and relying on the distinctive sensitivity that we have in our feel for how things are working, that can be very heightened and astute. That is the kind of core of this research method. To speak to what these findings are suited for, they're not really useful for, and they're not intended for telling people what they ought to do or they must do or what always will work. There may be things you ought to do and you must do and always will work, but as a general rule, practice situations, our own situations, are so intricately diverse that what is principally important is noticing what actually suits your particular situation. And to respond to that, Schoen uses the term reflective transfer. So you see how practicing is working in one context and you explore how it might work in another. And so it's a different kind of generalization than you might expect, but a very appropriate one if your goal is to carry forward practice traditions. This is a passage from Gendlin, just underlining the discipline, the kind of discipline, the somatic discipline that felt sensing brings. Our feel for our situations involves a level of embedding that's more obviously profound than, for example, the stories we have to say about our situations. And these text in black are two that are crucial there. So if you know focusing, or if you think about editing a piece of text, you'll be very familiar with noticing that you feel the discomfort and you feel the fit, and you feel the words as they're coming, and words that don't fit don't feel right. There's a kind of a discomfort there, and that kind of process is the underlying somatic process that Gendlin's focusing work is based on, and consequently this work is too. And from a research perspective, it's got a kind of explicatory validity if your intention is, when you do your felt sensing work, to describe accurately what your experience is. So by an explicatory validity, I mean that if you're relying on your somatic embedding and the felt sense that's coming from that to provide the words and to assure the fit of those words to your experiencing, you've got a more holistic grasp in play in your saying what is happening. So it's got a validity that comes from approach with the right intention, from being as valid as an explication as you're able to do. When it comes to think about reliability, which is the twin of validity in many research environments, the reliability is hermeneutic. So those who know focusing will know that as you're sitting with an issue, the words that fit it, the words that seem appropriate to say what's happening, change as you go through a process of sitting with something. And that change process may, from a content point of view, involve multiple changes in frames of reference, changes in language, etc. But there is a hermeneutic reliability in that you can always tell the story of how those changes came and why they made sense. So these are the foundations of felt sense-centered reflective practice, providing a kind of disciplining for practice research. Oops. So I want to move on now to talk about one of two examples. It's researching sensibilities. It's an example from environmental management practice. And I just note that environmental management means here managing our ecological presence more self-consciously and responsibly. It doesn't have the connotations of control that management sometimes happens, because we do not control our environments. And sensibility is defined here, as I'll develop in a sec, as a feel for what may occur and what it may be helpful to do. So what's at stake here? I can introduce it by giving you a bit of a story. In the late 1980s, that's when I started in environmental advocacy, and I was working then, amongst other things, on what we call greenhouse gases, so a framing that we would now commonly think about in terms of as climate change. I realized I could make a larger difference if I became professionally trained, so I did retrain, and I worked in the adaptive management tradition, which is a tradition that's very sensitive to uncertainties, and then went to work with one of the clients that I was working with a university-based colleague, and worked there. And what I noticed was that the kind of strategic planning adaptation that we focused on was important for orienting, but far more commonly, the kind of adaptation that occurred in a very fine-grained processes of the politics of organizational life was much more pervasive and in many ways more important. And I remember specifically sitting in an estuary management committee meeting, so looking at how this water body is being influenced by the activities on the land and in the estuary. And in a situation where I needed to kind of come up with something clear and helpful to say, and sitting there sort of savouring a number of points of reference. So the socio-ecological dynamics, the organisational politics, the managerial practicalities, ethics, etc. So sitting there in that meeting, noticing myself moving around in a kind of a felt space with many different kinds of considerations in play. And then a couple of years later, when I was moving to writing some of this stuff up research-wise, I was finding myself asking the question, what is going on in that process? How do we describe the kind of savouring of options that's going on there? And to give an indication of why that is an important question to ask in an environmental management context, this quote in pink is from the end of a paper on marine ecosystem management for large marine ecosystems. And I just read it to you because it's worth taking in what it leaves out, what it marginalizes. Inherent difficulties in harmonizing jurisdictional conflicts are mainly of a political nature. One important objective of a large marine ecosystem regime is to tackle the problems resulting from political boundaries. But in the final analysis, it has to depend on political solutions. The successful application of an ecosystem management approach to large marine ecosystems has to come to a great extent from collective political will and mutual cooperation of the states concerned. Now, this is a paper on thinking through how to manage these kinds of ecosystems. Right towards the end of it, the author basically says, look, I've given you my technical analysis. The politics is somebody else's business. Now, what's striking about that is how unsatisfactory that is for a practitioner. Anybody who's a practitioner lives in the midst of evolving politics. And these observations are trite from that perspective. So the question becomes, how can you describe those in a way that is not trite? Sensibility is the feel we have for situations like that in any practice situation we're familiar with. They're kind of viscerally familiar, so we can feel them, but they're intellectually unfamiliar. There's a kind of a holism, an openness, and a creativity that's difficult to to express. And the approach that I've developed is one for modelling sensibilities, as I'm using sensibilities in a slightly altered way to describe that kind of feel, and using a non-standard logic that has distinct roots in Gendlin's concept of implying and in particular reviving and interaffecting. This, which will be too small for you to read, is an example of part of a sensibility model. A typical description is more than one page plus some supporting text. But I'll take you into a detailed one in a minute, but this comes from a consulting project, and it comes from a report which was written to describe the process so that others could learn from the process of this environmental management project. And this one's a little more is larger, so I hope you can kind of read it. I'll just walk you through it a little. It's noticing that, so I'll just walk through a bit sequentially, and then I'll talk about how it functions as a sensibility. So, not uncommon to recognise that funding is critical in a situation like this, and not uncommon to find that there are all sorts of damages to the ecosystems for which there are no funds set aside previously. It's also not uncommon, moving across to the right, for the planning process to be funded as it was here, but for no funds to be specified for implementation. That's actually very common in government environmental management processes, because political problems can be solved by planning. Very often things will go off the agenda, and it's a much more and it's not at all uncommon for the plans to be made and the implementation to be avoided because of the different order of magnitude of costs. So that's one part of difficulty, and then that still points towards developing many new tools. And I've got some notes here about developing a funding strategy. We talked about using grants and rates in the local government area. We talked about using developers to contribute to fund peer review of their own proposals, land development funds, and so on. Now, that's what I've just done there. Is I've kind of walked through that sequentially, but you'll notice it's a nonlinear structure. And when you're reading this as a sensibility model, you're reading it from your own feel for your practice situation. So I don't imagine anybody else here is engaged professionally in environmental management. But if you look at a diagram like this from the perspective of where you are seeking funding, so we're all interested in, for example, grant research funding. One of the things it brings to mind is the ways in which the kind of work we want to do is not readily funded. Well, some of it is not readily funded in institutions we want to work, and it points towards the kind of process of creatively responding to that and coming up with alternatives. And there's a kind of a process of savouring the sensibility that is what this is when it's being read as a sensibility model. It's being read from felt sensing. So the fundamental thing to say about developing models of sensibilities, or two fundamental things really. One is that practicing reflectively and experimentally in a felt sensing centered way is the foundation. And if you're not the practitioner, you need to work with practitioners who are doing that. And then its importance is that it provides a way of describing the knowing how that in a way that's accessible to skilled practitioners. It's certainly the case that for novices, procedural descriptions are better. So nobody in this audience, I think, is probably other than a novice in this context. But if you are a professional working in the area, your sensitivities are already relatively well developed. And a sensibility model is a more direct way of communicating what empirically people have been relying on their decision-making processes. So there's an unusual logic to it. Perhaps implying replaces perhaps doing, because it's about pointing to the strands in a crossing, the elements in a crossing. Perhaps finding picks up Gendlin's emphasis on stoppages, that are places where we might iterate and then from which new things might emerge. It's a kind of an alternative way of thinking about practices as opposed to repertoires of procedures. So some provocative implications. This might seem like a simple thing, but it's actually not at all a normal thing to try and describe the field for practice situations that practitioners are relying on. As the quote I read earlier shows, it's common in environmental management in particular for decision-making situations to be stripped of their contexts when they're being analysed. It's also commonplace for the open sense of that we experience implying our way forward to be dropped out of analysis. It's also commonplace for people, as Bourdieu has emphasised, for the way in which environmental management and other practice situations are described to be done in such a way that it makes the practitioners look like analysts as opposed to people who are doing things in evolving situations. And one of the implications of that is that, the other thing to notice is that quite often when advice is provided, like that example of that paper I used at the start, what in effect is being done is you're providing hypotheses that practitioners would need to try out in actual situations to see if they can be made effective. So there's kind of actually quite a profound gap in the way a lot of the practice research is done from the point of view of having an impact, a helpful impact on practice. And if we carry on avoiding when we avoid the lived complexity, we're disempowering people, and we're actually not dealing with the fundamental environmental challenges that we face. We do need tools that are helpful for capable practitioners to help them go deeper. That's much harder to provide than tools that are good for novices. And there are many opportunities to take in this stuff further. There's sort of large numbers of situations where sensibility modelling is a way of making the knowing how that skilled practitioners are relying on, that you can discern empirically through felt sensing-based reflection processes, making that know-how accessible to other people. So that's one example of an area where the philosophy of the implicit, Gendlin, can have a significant impact on practice research. I want to turn to a different kind now, which is much closer to the language or the roots of a process model. Process model was really developed to describe how felt sensing was possible, or to make sense of that. How could this arise, as it were? And I want to explore some variations that come from that. So another kind of story, the context for this is I learned focusing in the late 1980s. And when I learned it, I realized it was kind of a more generic version of a way I had, a practice I had for reading literature in poetry, novels, etc. I wanted, because I came from a strong philosophy and psychology background, a stronger conceptual understanding than Gene's focusing book provided. And at the time, I couldn't get hold of any of his other texts. Then I found a process model online when the internet, the World Wide Web in particular, really took off. And I set up a process of reading a process model from Dzogchen, which is a Tibetan Buddhist direct realization tradition, and reading a process model from Dzogchen. And I did that in order to create some difference. And then the sort of seminal experience from which the instance, in thinking at the edge terms, from which this emerged, was in the middle of the night in New York when I was there teaching a process model, as Gendlin had invited me over to do that. And sitting with this question about, well, how can a process model describe the kinds of experiences that Dzogchen is evoking and has a very explicit grasp of? And I realized that that the order of the space that focusing is embedded in could be approached not simply as the forward moving edge that we usually engage with it as, but also as a place that's iterating. And I sort of sat with what's ongoing in the focusing process. And out of that fell a kind of vastness oneness. So to say a little bit more about that, when we're focusing, it's kind of common to be forwardly oriented and to be oriented towards felt senses. It's much less common to be noticing the qualities of presence as a focuser and noticing the qualities of the space we're in, and to be noticing the underlying kind of rhythms, the other underlying flavors in the process. And a process model actually encourages a shift to those underlying rhythms, because it emphasizes stopping and iterating as a platform from which new kinds of practice, new kinds of process can emerge. And interestingly enough, it's something that's very common in traditions of meditation, where you might focus on breathing or presence of awareness. So a process model provides a strong encouragement for shifting within focusing practice from the forward edge moving with the consideration we're dealing with to noticing the background and ongoing qualities. And so having had the experience myself, the challenge really was
Greg, do you think you could go back, because this is so exciting, this last slide, and slow down a bit and
okay.
and just lead us through this one again?
Righto. This particular slide, or
because it's such a specific example of what you do. How different moves of practice know-hows can create such an innovative step. Can you?
Okay. Yep. And I'll show. You want here or the diagram?
Yeah. Maybe the diagram, and then the diagram, and then that would be really great.
Okay. All right. So this diagram, the picture on the left, is kind of how I experience felt sensing space when I'm focusing. So I'm aware of my presence as a focuser. I'm aware of the space I'm in, and I'm aware of the felt senses, the felt understandings of particular issues I'm working with. And there might be multiple of those in the space. There may be just one. There's often more than one. And so I might have, for example, when I was getting up for this talk, I had both a felt sense of the situation of giving this talk, and then anxiety came in about the performative aspect of a talk like this. And so I was sitting with the two of those there, and I actually did then play with some of the practice variations we're about to go on and talk with. But to be sitting with those two kinds of phenomena, which are both salient here and now for me, is common in focusing. And the little dots at the back of the focuser there, both in the presence and space, point to the fact that there's the background stuff I'm often not terribly aware of. Sometimes background things come forward and they're very salient and they need to be brought into the space. The anxiety was one of those. But in general, focusing is set up to help us move forward, live forward with the issues, the problems, the creative tasks, whatever it is that we're working with. And it is not usual when in the way focusing is taught to notice the background qualities of space and the background qualities of presence. Some of presence is there in noticing focusing attitude, but the wider ground of being present in a space with ideas, with issues, considerations, interiorly, The more general qualities of presence are not brought into sharp focus in focusing practice as it is usually taught. Doesn't mean that sometimes people don't drop in there and get very interested, but that's not the paradigmatic form. And in a similar fashion, the qualities of space, like if I check my space now, there's a kind of a sort of a play of kind of, it's a bit of anxiety, there's a kind of anxiety, excitement pole for moving backwards and forwards. And I can feel that kind of movement as the kind of ground for speaking from for me right now. Not so usual to do that. Now, normally in a focusing movement, you take that and you'd say, oh, okay, so I've got this anxiety, excitement pole, and how do I work forward with that? An alternative is to say, okay, I can feel these background qualities of spaciousness. Let's just sit with that and allow things to happen. And as I say on this next slide, that is somewhere where meditation practice much more commonly focuses. So on breathing or meditation. So letting come, letting be, letting go, for example. Letting is just resting in a very persistently relaxed relationship to what we're experiencing. And a process model emphasizes the significance of those kind of iterating processes, because the movement from behavior to gestural language, which then evolves into kind of proto-language, cultural patterns in a process model, happens through sitting with iterating stuff. And the movement into focusing happens with sitting with iterating stuff. So I'm comfortable about a situation. I am struggling with it, but then if I sit with the quality of the struggle, a felt sense of the situation can fall out. So the logic of the experience, I was sitting there in the middle of the night in New York thinking, okay, well, what is there in my focusing process that could be a stopped thing where I'm iterating that I might then find functioning as a registry through which another kind of experience might fall out? And quite a lot of things are there, actually. There's a kind of background gladness in the carrying forward that happens persistently once you're an experienced focusing practitioner. There can be qualities of sort of stillness, for example. Stillness is not the right. Qualities of quietness. If I notice myself now, a background curiosity, for example, is there. So this is taking the logic of a process model and applying it within focusing practice to explore the potential for forward movement in another kind of process. Now, is that enough, Donata, to do that bit? Okay. I'm looking at the clock and thinking I've still got a fair bit I want to cover, but anyway, we're still got not too much more. So it's one thing to have had that experience personally. It's to be confident or reasonably confident about its general usefulness. You want to try it out with other people. So I set up a research project working with a number of experienced focusing practitioners, and I scaffolded them in practice using the stuff using a scaffold that evolved from my initial experience, because I obviously iterated many times, practicing this experience. And I drew on the felt sensing based reflection, and I crossed into that Peterman Gen's elicitation interview protocols, and the analysis was guided by grounded theory and a few other sources, which we can go into later if necessary. But I ran essentially a small research project to check whether the practice scaffolds that I developed were at least usable by people who were experienced focusers. And so this is just I just walk you through quickly through some of the results. This is the scaffold I gave. So I figured looking for things that are in the background, but let me go straight to the results. So some people used background qualities of the space, curiosity and a willingness to notice. The stuff is an example of that. Others used kind of a background quality of pulsing, comings and goings. This is, again, that's another quote from somebody. and another person had a background sense of my existence. So they found ongoing aspects of their process which they could sit with, not in the usual moving forward focusing way, but just in a kind of resting and allowing things to fall out way. And the three different characteristics of the space, the shift in space that came out, are highlighted in this slide on the next. So kind of radical simplicity, nothing to do, nothing to be said there. There's some other space that's not time, so it's kind of being out of time. Stillness, stark silence. And then experiences of vastness. So there's a spaciousness that's very vast, one person said. It's a beautiful black velvety infiniteness. The space feels like the ground that lives fall out of. And at the same time, with the vastness, a sense of oneness. It's like I'm the whole thing, like I'm everything. I was no longer an individual. It's like you lose your ego and there's an infinite self. So these are very striking experiential reference. And for those who know, talk of non-duality in Buddhist traditions, you could have run into that. You may have run into it in Christian practice as well, and other traditions that I don't know of. Those are the two others that I practice in. So it's a very striking example of a shift in the possibilities from working with focusing practice as a ground. And it's a very substantial shift in the platforms of your process. It's worth saying, and in my chapter on this, I cover this at much more length, but Gendlin expects every new space to bring about an experience of vastness, because it's holding the whole of this is how he talks about a felt sense, holding the whole of the situation. So what warrants thinking of this kind of vastness, oneness, as a new kind of space from a process model perspective. And when I say that, this is the evidence I rely on. Firstly, it's arising from holding and letting, which is a paradigmatic way for a new kind of space to arise in a process model. But I don't know that I wouldn't assume that holding and letting under all circumstances leads to a new kind of space. So that's just one leg of the thing. The second is that the practitioners experience the space as very different. So the quality of spaciousness is completely strange. A different space opens up that's bigger than me. The focusing space is quite individual, it's mine. In the spaciousness, when I moved into it, I was no longer an individual. So their experience is that there has been a very significant shift in the kind of space that they're experiencing being in. And then it's a space with a different ontology. Focusing, as per the diagram I had showed before, the ontology is of the focuser present in a space with the felt senses, and that's what Gendlin describes in chapter 8 of the process model. In this space, stillness rather than forward movement, vastness, of a different order of vastness, it needs to be said, and oneness at the same time, a characteristic. So it's got a different ontology in the sense that each of the different spaces that Gendlin delineates in a process model has its own ontology. So there's plenty of room for debate and more research around that, but that's why I currently see it as and I do see it as a different kind of space, and I experience it as such. I won't go any of the details here. I've just got a couple of slides here from an extensive analysis of how this can be modeled as an extension of a process model, conceptually. If anybody wants the text, it was a conference paper that's all laid out in detail, and I can send it to
you. For a matter of time, that we do still have enough time to, go in depth with the conversation. Just consider.
Righto.
Yeah.
I've only got one more section I want to cover. It won't take too long. So just to be aware that it is possible to do the schematizing in a disciplined way that follows the internal logic of a process model. And learnings, I guess the main one from our point of view is it's a very striking illustration of reflective practice experiment, which is felt sensing centered function and functioning using concepts from a process model to provide a very striking shift in kind of process. And it's got a lot more significance than that, of course. it's a precious and interesting place to explore, and it has a lot of potential ramifications from a social change point of view. But I want to finish off just by summarising the sort of research opportunities that are implied by these two examples in the context I've set. First of all, just to acknowledge that innovation often happens with auteurs, individuals who come up with very exciting new practices, and then we have people who follow them in their practice tradition. And Gendlin himself is like that with focusing, but there are many others that you may well be familiar with. Then to acknowledge there are patches of integration, like creative thinking research working across lots of practices, reflective practice research working across lots of forms of reflective practice. But there is a lack of a general program looking at the platform skills functioning together, inter-affecting, as Jean would put it, in the shaping of living. So there's a kind of a platform skills research agenda, which is actually hard to tackle when you chop the practices into separate practices and you don't consider how they're grounding in the fundamental character of aliveness. And we do have trip maps for particular practices. We do have maps of particular areas, but if we think of it in those metaphors, what the question it raises is what's the implied landscape? And there's a lot of things that point to the landscape, and arguably a process model can be seen as a kind of a providing foundational concepts for understanding the landscape of kinds of practice. It certainly does do that. But there are lots of other motivations to treat that sense that there's a landscape to be mapped here seriously. The kinds of space stuff that I've been talking about is very important. The emphasis on implying is interesting. Mintzberg, Writing and Management, talks about the disorderliness of managerial life, but what's obvious when he says that is he's missing the implying, which is organising the living of managers who are dealing in chaotic and multifaceted situations. So we have in the sort of both the Gendlin practice traditions and the Gendlin conceptual frameworks sort of quite strong tools for getting going with platform skills research. I do think there's room to have a new discipline here, but if it's not going to be a new discipline, there's at least a very significant field of study that we could engage with. And a process model makes it possible to enter into this in new ways. And then lastly, I think that these examples show there's quite substantial transformative potential taking philosophy of the implicit conceptual frameworks and practices into practice research. We've seen a new way of researching and documenting knowing how, which is useful for dealing with skilled practice, conveying skilled practice. It does that because it relies on felt sensing and it's sensitive to the embedding, to the interleaving, the crossing of considerations, and the second example shows us a very significant opportunity to carry forward a practice tradition in the unexpected directions. So anyway, I think there's lots of reasons to think that there's some interesting stuff to do. And now, after the references, at last, comments and questions.